Hello and welcome to the Granada debate. I'm Alison Mackenzie. First tonight is universal credit driving the poorest deeper into poverty. The government's flagship benefit, which aims to help people get back into work, was first trialled in the UK in Ashton-under-Lyne, Oldham, Warrington and Wigan. But critics say the 6 weeks people are being made to wait for payments is far too long. This report by our political correspondent Daniel Hewitt.
You do it.
Me do it.
Denley Walton's life has been turned upside down by universal credit. The mum from Bolton had to wait 8 weeks for her first payment after moving onto the new system.
Yeah.
She fell behind on her rent and lost her daughter's nursery place, unable to pay the fees. And with no one else to look after Eliza, Denley had to quit the part-time job she'd held down for the last 7 years.
It was awful. I was so depressed and down, like I had thoughts of killing myself, and it was just horrible. One of the times when I was on the phone to him, I was that upset, like I was even crying saying this to him, and they rang me back threatening to ring social services on me.
Denley's story of debt and despair is repeated across Greater Manchester, where 45,000 people have been moved on to the new system, which is set to be rolled out across the country. In Wigan, 80% of people on the scheme are in rent arrears. That's compared to just 36% on the old benefit system. It's a similar story in Oldham, where 68% of people on universal credit have fallen behind on their rent. 1 in 4 of those people are now facing legal action to recover it, and 15 families have already been evicted from their homes.
Divvy Abrahams.
And it's that evidence fueling calls from Labour to pause the rollout of the scheme.
These measures are pushing people into debt, rent arrears and even homelessness. Last year, the Housing Association Federation warned that approximately 80% of tenants on UC were in rent arrears, with a 6-week delay being attributed as the key cause. We cannot allow the devastating impacts of universal credit rollout to happen.
Earlier in the day, the minister in charge of universal credit did reverse one element of the policy. Claimants will no longer be charged to call up and discuss their claim. After it emerged, some were paying up to 55 pence a minute.
Prime Minister.
But at Prime Minister's questions, Theresa May made it clear the rollout will go ahead as planned.
It's a system that encourages people to get into the workplace. It is a system that is working because more people are getting into work. And pausing universal credit won't help those people bringing home more pay for their families.
There you go.
That's certainly not Denley's experience, and she says until the system is paused and improved, she won't be the last.
Well, joining me in the studio tonight to discuss, Chris Green, the Conservative MP for Bolton West. He sits on that Work and Pension Select Committee. And the Labour MP for Manchester Central, Lucy Powell. Welcome both. Chris Green, there you were, quizzing the Secretary of State yesterday. There's universal credit, lots of questions being asked, particularly in the North West. Why is it pursuing in the way it is? Why can't it be paused?
Well, I think the principles behind universal credit have widespread agreement that you need a welfare system that supports people into getting a job and supports people into getting more hours. At the moment, people are often limited to having 16 hours, so we do need a new system, but at the moment, universal credit is failing far too many people. So this is what we have to do. We have to focus on what reforms, what changes we have to implement on universal credit before we go any further.
But do you want it to be paused now? Do you think it should be paused?
I think David Gauke, by actually reforming the phone system, making it a free phone, shows he's ready to reform it. Now, if he can reform, if he can make the changes that we need in the very short term, then we can go ahead. If not, we've got to have a pause.
Lucy Powell, you have some very tough cases in your own constituency to report on. What is the scale of the issue here on universal credit? Trialled in the North West, not working very well.
The scale is enormous. Many of my constituents are already on universal credit, and I had a letter just a few days ago from the DWP outlining the extra job centres in my area that are now going to go to the full rollout. So if, as Chris is saying, we're going to see some concessions, that process needs stopping beforehand, because I think the whole point of this is that it's supposed to be a pilot scheme in parts of the North West to test out the system. We can see from that test it is just not working. It is pushing people into severe problems, into debt, depression, pushing people out of work, which is exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. So we really need to halt that process now, take stock of the pilot and the findings experience of those pilots and make some radical changes to it.
How can such a scheme help people back into work with it starting on such a weak basis?
Well, actually, within the current system, there's a clear incentive to get up to 16 hours of work and do no more than that. Now, if you only do 60 hours a week, an employer may not give you as much training as otherwise. You don't get the experience because you're only doing 16 hours a week. So if you don't have the training, you don't have qualifications, you don't have the experience, how do you get a better job, or how do you get promotion at work? And so I think there are a huge number of reasons why universal credit is the right move. But
Not
the
working
system,
yet.
I know,
It's embarrassing, isn't it, for your government, because it's a system which you have given good authority on that will get them back into work, but it's actually now just limping to the start side. It cannot get past this 6 weeks of waiting, this 8 weeks of waiting.
And I think the Secretary of State must be aware of this. I'm absolutely sure he is aware of it. He must know that the reason why only 8% of universal credit has been rolled out so far is because there are so many glitches, there are so many problems that Lucy's been talking about. And to hear the stories yesterday in the debate in Parliament is heartbreaking, what the impact it's had on people. So I think David Gauke has to be listening to this, and he has to realise that if only 8% has been rolled out so far, it's because there are major problems that do need resolving.
A big debate and lots of tough stories that were heard, but the Conservatives abstained. You didn't take part in that vote. That doesn't reflect well on democracy.
Exactly, as I was going to say, because it's great to hear Chris saying all this, but he doesn't put his money where his mouth is.
Well, actually, the Labour Party.
I'm asking you why you didn't vote.
If we had a general election tomorrow, the Labour Party would keep universal credit, and the initial debate is actually broadcast and shown in the debate. It was to pause and fix universal credit.
Absolutely, what you're now advocating here today.
Absolutely, but
so why didn't you vote with us?
But halfway through the debate, actually, the information saying what the debate was about pause. Paused, I think, to kill and stop.
No, it was to fix. Our position is clear, because there are the principle of universal credit, as Chris says, to allow a more flexible system where people can advance in work and take on more hours without finding themselves penalised within a benefits system, is a good one. There are some major flaws, however, though. One is the 6 week wait, which is just not how people in work get paid either. And if you're going from a weekly budget to having to wait 6 weeks to a sort of retrospective monthly one, it is of course going to cause problems. But also critically, and one of the reasons why Ian Duncan Smith, who is the author of Universal Credit, resigned from the government a couple of years ago, was because the changes to the amount of money in the system and the tapering, as they call it, so how much you lose when you go into work, have been so radically stripped back and reduced that actually the work incentive of the system is now going all together.
That lady in Daniel's report, she had a part-time job, she couldn't do it, she was so short of cash not working. Chris Green, again, it's people like that suffering, but it's giving this universal credit a bad name. It needs sorting, it needs pausing and sorting. Why didn't you vote with the Labour yesterday?
Well, as I said, initially the vote was supposed to be on pausing and fixing, and actually it was changed during the debate, and it's about just stopping the system.
Motion was clear.
No, the motion was actually changed, and it was raised during the debate that it was no longer about fixing, and Labour ought to have been far more positive about the changes they wanted to see. And during the debate, it was raised during the debate, it was actually the motion was changed from what it was originally, and the fixing, that amending, that changing and improving was taken out of it. That's why I couldn't support.
A lot on the technicality there, but again, these are people watching this show that in the Northwest, they're literally struggling. The money seems to be just not coming in on time. Maybe eventually that will happen and it'll be affected and come in properly. Maybe just give it more time.
No, I think there are too many of these fundamental problems. That's the issue, and I've been inundated with cases. Many of them have appeared on Granada reports this week, of people who just cannot now get themselves out of this situation. If you're taking away a whole month or more, a month and a half of any income at all away from people who are living on the breadline in the first place, it's impossible for them to then get themselves out of that circumstance. And as I say, there is a fundamental flaw now in the tapering to not make
too rigid.
To not make work pay. So I've got another case from a father of 3 who's in work, he's on universal credit. It's not worth his while being in work at the moment, And that's the opposite effect of what universal credit should be, because he's having too much of his income taken away under universal credit, and that's not how it's supposed to have been designed. So those two, and they're very, very big issues, need resolving before
Katrina,
we
can you
can
come
see
back
this
on that
roll
there,
out.
specific
Well, it's,
examples?
The 6-week period is completely arbitrary, as far as I can see, and is completely inconsistent, because universal credit is designed to help people get people into work. Most people do have salaries, and it's to put that in the welfare system in sync with the work system.
So,
and this 6 weeks is actually out of sync. It's actually inconsistent with the vision
you
behind
prefer
it.
4 weeks?
Yeah, I think that's what we have to head
maybe a
towards.
change.
Yeah.
Will you take some of these messages back when you were quizzing David Gauke, but on the chatter on the Conservative benches, you're not the only one thinking that it needs fixing, are you?
Absolutely, and this is where, perhaps more so behind the scenes, but certainly a whole load of Conservative members of Parliament are really concerned about this and will be raising these concerns.
Well, hopefully we'll see some changes sooner rather than later.
Just coming to a close on this section of the show, if you were in power tomorrow, would Labour keep it, just change it, fix it, pause it? What would you do if you suddenly...
Well, we have said we would pause it in order to fix it, fix some of the big problems that we've got within it, about the incentives for work, about the time delay, and actually just some of the competence issues around it. You know, there are lots of problems with it as well. So that's the whole point of pilots, of rolling things out gradually, is to make sure that it's smooth, and it's not.
Thank you for that now, both.